I swear one day these stupid cacao versus cocoa infographics are gonna give me a professional stroke because it's not possible that in 2025 consumers are still being misled by this crap. When I saw another one of these posts just a couple of days ago on Instagram getting tons and tons of likes, comments, and share, I decided I had enough and I had to make a video about this. So let's talk about it. Why are these infographics and, in general, what I'd personally call an artificial debate about cacao versus cocoa so important to debunk? On one side, you have regular people making stuff up because they just don't know any better. And that's not bothering me, I swear, because they're probably just regular chocolate lovers regurgitating whatever they find online. The real culprits are brands and companies that sell chocolate and cacao products, so technically they should know better, but consciously decide to spread misinformation because it helps them to sell more of their low quality products. And they simply play and prey, actually, on the fact that people don't know any better. But let's start from the beginning. The biggest premise is that there is absolutely no difference between the term cacao and the term cocoa. Cacao is, of course, the more ancient term that belonged to the first indigenous communities in Mesoamerica that grew and used cacao in their daily lives as currency, as one of the main ingredients in their sacred beverages, and so on. And cacao comes from the word cacao, K-A-K-A-W, tracing all the way back at least to the Olmecs, but the word could be even older than the Olmecs. And nowadays, cacao is the word used in Spanish-speaking countries. Now, if you look at the history of the term cocoa instead, you will discover that it started to circulate in Europe around the 17th century when the first batches of cocoa beans started to come from the cocoa-producing countries, at that time Central and South America, before production started in Africa. And especially the British are believed to have popularized the word cocoa. Why? Because, well, imagine a British person trying to pronounce the word cacao. Cacao, cocoa, cocoa. Well, there you have it. So there was no initial distinction. It was just cacao was Spanish and cocoa was English. Now, because the term cocoa was born far away from where the trees and the raw fruits were growing, because the Brits were such a supremacy, and because the Industrial Revolution, where a lot of the chocolate machines that we use nowadays were born, was just around the corner, over time, cacao became associated with the raw, unprocessed, far away form of cacao, while cocoa became tied to the more refined, processed European products. So this cacao equal unprocessed and cocoa equals processed started to make its way into people's minds, and also professionals started to adopt this distinction. I still remember in one of the first books I bought on chocolate all the way back in 2013, written by a very renowned chocolate expert, there was this distinction inside the book. So that's also what I believe to be true at the beginning of my chocolate career. But if you think about reality, the practical way we do things in the industry every day, this distinction isn't useful at all. You understand clearly whether a cacao item is processed or not just by looking at it. Cacao nibs are tiny pieces of roasted cacao beans, so they are processed whether you call them cacao nibs or cocoa nibs, just because raw nibs don't exist. Another one, the cacao fruit hanging from the tree is clearly unprocessed whether you call it cacao pod or cocoa pod, just because a processed fresh fruit does not exist. Are you getting what I'm saying? It's not calling something cocoa or cacao that tells you how processed or unprocessed, healthy or unhealthy the product in front of you is. Also, these terms aren't even regulated by law. The terms chocolate, cocoa, bittersweet chocolate, semi-sweet chocolate are all regulated, but there is no trace about the difference between cocoa and cacao. I spent hours the other day looking at the FDA regulations for chocolate in the United States, the EU directive for the chocolate industry in Europe, and they do a big mixing of calling whatever cocoa and whatever cacao. For example, they call the raw beans cocoa beans, although they are unprocessed, and they call the pressed butter cacao butter, although it's clearly processed. You see, the difference is not in the wording, but in the product itself. It's the difference between a tree and a powder, between a fruit and the leaves. It doesn't matter how you call them, they are what they are. Now that you have all this info, we're gonna look at these infographics together, and I hope you can understand my frustration. And while we go through these images, I want you to remember this. All cacao products start from the seeds of a fresh fruit that need to go through several processes and machines to be turned into anything edible and sellable, like powders, nibs, paste, and chocolate. Products that last in your pantry for 3, 5, even 7 years. So, what could possibly be raw and unprocessed about these products? Let's have a look. First of all, it cracks me up how there is the image of a cacao pod on the left, but not on the right, like both powders didn't come from the same fruit. Plus, see how absurd it is that the cacao powder is minimal processing while the cocoa powder is highly processed? What could make a cocoa powder highly processed is a process called alkalization or Dutch process. Basically, the cacao is treated with potassium to reduce its natural acidity. And you can recognize a powder that has been alkalized because it has usually a darker brown color compared to the more natural cacao powders, which tends to be more light brown colored. But they don't say this here. They just say that cacao powder is minimally processed while the cocoa powder is highly processed. Based on what? Then one is heated at low temperatures and one is roasted at high temperatures. First of all, there is no heating the cocoa beans, like you can decide to just put them in the microwave. No, all cacao beans are roasted to be turned into powder. So why using another term like heating to make the cacao powder sound more natural? Lastly, the earthy, bitter taste compared to the sweeter taste. Why? They don't tell us whether sugar was added to any of them. It doesn't make any sense. So here instead, the nibs make you lose weight, but the powder makes you gain weight. Now, the only difference between the nibs and the powder is that the nibs contain a little bit more cacao butter, which on the contrary was pressed out of the cacao powder. But not even all of it, because usually a good 10 to 20% cacao butter stays in the powder even after the cacao butter is pressed out. So how does less cacao butter translate to weight gain? Unless, again, the powder has sugar added to it, but it doesn't say it here. Not all powders have sugar added to them. Then wait, how does one have more levels of cacao? If it's the same exact thing, giving more or less cacao butter doesn't matter. Also, the nibs enhance your mood, but if you pulverize them, they don't. I'm done with this already. It's so stupid. Here, cocoa is the powder, while cacao is the beans in a pot? Okay. The explanation about the cocoa powder is all about roasting at high temperatures. Well, bad news, 95% of the cacao on the market is roasted at high temperature, even the products called cacao on the packaging. But here's the thing, you will never know at what temperature the beans were roasted unless you go inside the factory of the chocolate maker and you look at the temperature on the oven screen. You will never know. So anybody can make these claims. While on the other side, they claim that this is cold pressed. No, there is no sufficient cold pressing that can get you from the beans to the nibs to the powder. You need some sort of heat to do that. Point blank, period. And in the cacao slide, the process removes the fat, which is the cacao butter. How? And wasn't more cacao butter the goal? I don't understand this, but I hope you are now understanding my frustration with this, whatever this is. And now we have another cacao nibs versus cocoa powder. The nibs are unprocessed, yes, because they totally look like the fresh fruit hanging from the tree, while the cocoa powder is processed. Same low temperature versus high temperature claims. You know, now you go look at all the ingredients at the supermarket that claim to be cacao and look whether they disclose the roasting temperature on their packaging. I'll be here waiting for you, and it's gonna take you at least a decade because nobody disclaims that information. Only craft bean to bar chocolate makers like to put that information on the packaging, but they're not the same brands making these stupid claims. No added chemicals versus alkalized with chemicals. Okay, but not all cacao powders are alkalized. And on one side, the nibs make you happy, while the powder makes you really sad. Well, this was everything I wanted to tell you, and I hope now you can start analyzing critically these kind of infographics when you come across them on the wild internet. See you in the next video.